finish this, I'd actually go right back to the beginning. It was one of the themes that was that came up in the survey, and just say a little bit so that it's really the beginning story is there, and maybe some of you are interested to know that. There was an international advisory board meeting here at Swinburne in about '98, and a person who I never met, I never found out who it was, asked the then VC, Ian Wallace, have you considered doing anything about futures? I'd love to know who that person was, but I don't. My friend Adolf Hannick, who some of you know, was present, and he said, had they thought of getting in touch with me? Well, basically what that meant was that Adolf and I met with Ian Wallace, and we were invited to write a proposal for a Foresight something. We didn't know what it was. And we did that, and we presented the proposal, and there was some cogitation took place in the high towers, and eventually they decided to go ahead with the Institute, and I was invited to take up the chair in '99. I still have a very, very clear image of sitting in this corridor. They gave me a chair, a table, a computer, and a corridor. There wasn't even a study or an office or anything. It was just this desk, this computer in this corridor. And from there we just started. And I have to say I couldn't have done the first accreditation on my own because I didn't know how to do it. I really understand the system coming in from outside. But there was some tremendous expertise available. And with the assistance of that person, we were able to put the first courses up, and they were accredited. So teaching began in 2000, and that was a furious period. You can imagine just a few of us working together to get this to happen. But there were some amazing high points after the accreditation. Getting the board together, we had a terrific board. Richard Haynes was the chairman, and a bit later on, Barry Jones agreed to be the patron of the AFI as it was. One of the odd after effects of the 9/11 disaster was that we were actually approached by the CEO of the Pratt Foundation, who said to me, we've decided to give you X $1,000 for your Foresight program. So we weren't knocking on the door of the sector, the philanthropic sector. They actually came to us and said, we'd like to give you some money. It's probably the only time it'll ever happen, but what it meant was that we were able to get a program of research up and running about social foresight. Rowena Rishi acted as the editor of the series of monographs, and that really all resulted from that. So that was one of the high points, just being awarded that money and being able to do that work, to be able to pay people. Some of the authors are here, Marie is one of them. And out of this, just evolving a sense that this was a viable entity. And what's more, people were discovering just something new. I mean, the comments I've heard from some of you that have had the pleasure of meeting for the first time are almost exactly the same comments that I heard back in the early days. So it's really interesting to know that the course had and is still having that sort of transformative effect for people to give them a context, give them a framework, and give them the opportunity to learn from each other. The only descriptor we could come up with for people taking the course was mid-career professionals. People who had already some life experience, therefore bringing a lot to this game to start with. And then there's tremendous intensity as people get together and figure out, what the hell did that in the knowledge base mean? What did that mean? And sharing their learning. Phase 2 began pretty much soon after I left in 2004, and Peter took over. And it was just amazing that they were able to get the course re-accredited in a much less welcoming environment. A new VC, lots of uncertainty. Marie was headed out elsewhere as well. And it wasn't an easy thing to do, to get that second re-accreditation, but Peter, with some high-quality assistance, I think, from other members of the faculty got that through. And it has been just brilliant to see the continued evolution of the course. I've slowly backed off and been back in Brisbane. One of the questions that I'm left with is, why are there so few of these things? And we know that they work. I mean, you're the living proof of that, and we've known that for some years. What is so difficult about setting up courses like this at Deakin, at Monash, in Sydney? It isn't that hard once you've got a model and you've got proof of concept, which we had by about 2003. So there's a question that's still left with me on that issue. Going back to the broader picture, I think things have changed a lot since I started back in '99. We've now seen the emergence of these two great macro drivers out there, peak oil and global warming, and both of them coming together are very challenging news, as I think you all know, for our species. And we can see the culture and society around us struggling to come to terms with what exactly that means. We're still exporting coal en masse, and we should by this stage probably know better. I guess, from my point of view, what it really comes down to, when you take the integral model seriously, is to acknowledge an uncomfortable fact, which is that at this point in time, it seems to me humanity is not sufficiently well integrated in itself to be coping well with this, what I call the early stages of a planetary emergency. And that is why I find the integral perspective so handy, because it just brings a level of clarity to things that seem contested and difficult, and in many cases are, but just in relation to values, for example, to see it through that filter of the spiral filter just brings so much into focus that I at least found very fuzzy before. The caveat here, I think, is that understanding something is just the first step. Effective action is much more challenging. In terms of my own work, as you know, I've continued to write, edit, and that sort of thing. I pushed out an issue of Foresight called Is America the Land of the Future? Well, I knew the answer before I started, but I needed the article, and the little subtitle well on in the piece said, America is not the future. Yeah! That's the bit I wanted to get in. However, it may be part of it. And so the sense of scaling down this monstrous version of America trying to take over the world is just one example of Then when I turned 60, my son brought me a Nikon SLR camera, and that enabled me to just go right back to one of my early loves, which is being out in the environment and particularly photographing birds in flight, which is quite challenging because they don't sit still for you. What I love about this partly is that they are their own creatures. They're not beholden to us except in their survival, which is a whole other issue. But they move about the world in their own ways, and if you want to be close to them, if you want to understand them, if you want to appreciate them, you actually have to enter their world and for a while leave your world behind. To me, that's just amazing. On the work front, I recently returned from the UK where there were 4 different unis doing different work in this area, and an ESRC-funded set of seminars with which I took part in one of those. And I came back really encouraged because, having left the UK 20 plus years ago, I just basically gave up thinking that anything would ever happen there, because H.G. Wells complained of the same thing. It wasn't going to change that quickly. However, this time there really were some very interesting, very capable, well-placed, sassy, intelligent, persistent people with some funding. And that to me was a real revelation. As I said at one of the meetings too, when I left the UK back in the late 80s, I wasn't ever sure I'd be invited back, but I was. In terms of my own, finally wrapping this up about my own stuff, I've finished a book. I'm grateful to Peter and Gretchen and some others too for providing feedback on something I've called the biggest wake-up call in history. It's my attempt to try and bring together to define what is the problem. Did limits to growth really mean something? I think it did. What does it mean now? And to look at solutions. Part 2 of the book is all about how people have conceptualized solutions. And particularly shifting from an overshoot and collapse fatalism, which I really think is not that helpful, to an emerging discourse about dissent. Not D-I-S-S, but D-E-S-C. And informed, of course, by a person many of us have talked about on this day, John Michael Greer's work, his work on the long descent and the ecotechnic future. It's amongst the best material I think we have available to us. If you're interested in seeing where the book has got to, it'll be an ebook out very shortly before it becomes a real hard copy book. The intro and chapter outline are both on my weblog, so you can look those up if you're interested. As I was getting to the end of the book, it really weighed on me that I needed to finish it with a lift. I mean, it's actually quite difficult to deal with such challenging material that you know people can respond to by saying, oh, this is too hard, this is depressing, too negative. How do you finish a book that's dealt with a lot of that on a high? And what I chose to do was to find 3 exemplars, people who we can look to, who have walked this walk, and like all of us, found their own very specific individual solutions, ways forward that they can take, which have been helpful for others. The first one was James Hansen, the climate scientist, who's been pilloried in so many environments in the US. But his work, his book, The Storms of My Grandchildren, some of you may have heard of that, is one of the most modest and luminously intelligent books I've ever come across by anyone, let alone by someone who says, I'm a scientist, I don't write. I mean, this is a wonderfully rich and honest book. And I think Hansen has also jumped the divide from being a scientist to an activist. When some students in the UK blockaded a train taking coal to a power station and were arrested, Hansen went over and defended them so they didn't go to jail. And this is not part of being a scientist, this is part of being a human being that's willing to put, skin in the game, as they say. And so I see Hansen as being a very inspirational character. The second one from another country is Muhammad Yunus. Many of you will know of his work with the Grameen Bank, it's now quite famous. But again, if you look where he started, it was the sight of a woman in poverty making a basket and asking her the questions, where did this come from, how much do you get for it? And going away and realizing that there was another way to do things. And that one man's inspiration has led to a vast expansion. There's really an empire, a Grameen empire now. And these are the kind of examples we need, because it's so easy to feel overwhelmed by the forces of not interested, don't care out there. Well, these examples are counter to that. Finally, the third example that I chose was Joanna Macy. Again, some of you may know of her work. I had the great pleasure of going to a week-long intensive with her just a few weeks before I came to Australia in the late 80s in Cumbria, in the UK. And what I learned from her is that, remember her work, some of her early work was called Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age. So she looked right into the abyss of nuclear devastation and found ways to help people, herself first, and then other people through that. So she had all this despair and personal empowerment work behind her. And what I learned from Joanna Macy was that it really doesn't matter how awful the situation is that you think you're confronting. There are always incredibly powerful places to go to deal with it. You are never alone, you are never without resources Those resources are always there. You just have to find them for yourself, whatever is relevant to what you're facing. So these people, it seemed to me, were a great way to finish the book, because they helped to resolve this theory to action dilemma that we face. And that is really why the thought I want to leave you with today. Some of you are running successful businesses, that's brilliant. But what now for this group, this alumni group? Where do you take it? It's time, I think, to move on, to see the academic program as a foundation for an awful lot of other sorts of activities. And I suppose the focus is on finding new ways to collaborate, new ways to innovate, to use new media. That's partly why I brought the movie here, to show you an example that came from another context. Wikipedia. Have you thought of actually going and updating the entries on Wikipedia that have to do with Foresight work? Wendy Schultz led what she called a Wikipedia raid several years ago, but it needs updating. I've heard about Pub Foresight. I've heard about Foresight Film Festival. With the tools that we now have available to us, we don't have to sit and cogitate and be frustrated about this difficulty of theory to action. There are many different things we could do. I guess the issue is really to decide what makes sense to you, what's worth doing. This question of where to for the alumni group could well be, this is my final thought, the core business for a subsequent event that you could call. It doesn't require us, the team that put this together, to do it. It's really your job to decide what needs doing and to put out that call and find 2 or 3 people who are interested and make it happen. I want to finish by saying a big thanks to Barbara, Gretchen, Rose Broadstock, who's not here, Monica, Karen, Peter Hayward, Marie, Philip Bateman for the AV. Would you please give everyone on the team a huge thank you?